Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitik Survey, created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard. The link is in the bio.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy by Takshashila Institution. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies team. And today I have with me Riya Sinha, the Associate Fellow at Center for Social and Economic Progress. Riya has also been a Maitri Fellow, which was supported by the Center for Australia-India Relations and the USSC. Riya, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Vanshika. I'm very happy to be back at the All Things Policy podcast for the second time this year. I mentioned the last time that I do listen to the podcast a lot, so I'm very happy to be featured the second time over here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ria. That just speaks volumes about the work. We're glad to have you again. So before we delve in, for all our listeners, Ria has been working for the Sambandh initiative, and what they work on recently has been the Sambandh database. So this is an online platform that consolidates data of India's infrastructure projects with its neighboring countries. So I know Ria, you and a lot of others have worked on it for a while, and so I'll just dive deep in without talking about it much and letting you do that. What inspired you to create the Sambandh database?
Thank you for that question. So the Sambandh database and map, India's regional connectivity links, that's the full name. This is a product of 4 years of work that we have put into an institutional initiative called Sambandh Regional Connectivity Initiative, which Dr. Constantino Xavier and I we started in 2020. And this initiative was a research and analytical initiative in which we were aiming to use data to map India's connectivity linkages with the neighboring countries. So, over the last 4 years, as part of this initiative, we have authored various research papers. We have collected a lot of data on India's connectivity projects across land, energy, transportation, the road, railway, inland waterways, integrated checkposts, many of India's connectivity projects. And we've also analyzed the different types of the mechanisms of cooperation that India uses with the neighboring countries. So, as a result, since 2020, we have this huge internal data with us. For some of our papers, also were creating maps. We are creating static maps that have helped us in our own research and analysis. So, it was mainly inspired from this, that we are sitting on this amazing data of India's connectivity initiatives with the neighboring countries, but what else can we do with this data? And then when we were conducting our own research and analysis, that we realized that there's no such single database that exists for India's regional connectivity projects, especially an a South Asian Indian database, that exists. MEA has something called a development cooperation dashboard, several other parts of the government. They have other dashboards, the Gati Shakti being one of them. But many of them are for internal use and not available to the public. So therefore, our objective was to create the first regional connectivity database, a public one detailing all of India's infrastructure links from project inception to completion. We are in the first phase of the database right now. So our database looks at India's projects with Bhutan. There are about 39 projects on the database. And The primary emphasis is on transport and energy infrastructure connections. We do aim to expand this database to different phases where we focus on the other countries as well. But yeah, to start with, we have the transportation energy projects between India and Bhutan as of now.
Right. So, first of all, let me just say thank you so much for doing this. To you, to all the associates at CSEP, because as we've discussed, our own neighborhood has been somewhat of a blind spot for India, right? I feel we've neglected our neighborhood, and we continue to do so in many ways. But having this data-driven, this physical visualization of how it looks, what we're doing there, what the status of our projects are. I think that's a really great initiative, and it was much, much needed, right? So, just continuing this conversation, I want to know, Ria, what were some of the challenges that you faced? Because, like you said, there was a lot of data, but it was not put together. And what were the methodologies that you used in collecting it? How did you collate it? How did you put it up? If there are some things you want to share.
Oh, yes. Plenty of challenges. Let me tell you that. It has, I mean, especially starting out, none of us were GIS or, map experts, and we were really starting.
Hmm.
We had this data in a scattered form and we had to bring it all together. So, I mean, I had a great team of, we had research analysts and interns who helped in the last few months in putting all of this together, in brainstorming on how to improve this. So, really grateful for their contribution as well. What this database is supposed to be, this is essentially a database with map as a representation, and this is what
Hmm.
makes it different. We wanted this to be useful for research and analysis and have a lot of data, project specific data, in terms of the location of a project, in terms of the entities involved, in terms of the timeline of a project, all of that to be there so that researchers can use it in different way. Some of the challenges that we faced, I think data sourcing and validation of data was the biggest challenge that we faced.
Hmm.
Between India and Bhutan, we are looking at 39 projects, and that itself took us several months because we also went through different. I mean, our priority was to look at government sources of data, so annual reports, the reports which were available at many of Indian missions in the neighboring countries. Research, sometimes research papers also. So we had to put all of that together, validate that data, because we also faced there were instances where something was reported as A in one document and B in another. So in the same government
Hmm.
also, we also had to validate all of that. So this was the process that took most amount of time. The second challenge was scaling down the database in terms of what was manageable for us given our existing resources. We started with a very big plan of what we can make this, how we can visualize this and what we can make this. But given the capacity and the resources we had to scale it down and be very realistic in terms of what we want to put on this database. At least whatever should be there has to be in the best form possible. And that's why we focus only on two sectors, on physical linkages, on the transportation and energy sector. One of the most difficult things was finding data for the financing of the projects.
Hmm.
Different sources had different information, so that was unfortunately something that we could not include right now, but we are looking forward to having more conversations on how to include that into the database. And then of course, putting the filters out there. Our idea was not to do an analysis. Our idea was to
Hmm.
give the information out there and let the policy makers, researchers, scholars use that information for different kinds of analysis. So this was broadly how we looked at it. First step was information collection, which took most of our time, then designing of the database, cleaning of the database, all these stages. And there we are today, where we've made the database live, with projects between India and Bhutan.
Right. Yes, the database is very, very comprehensive, and I would encourage all our listeners to check it out. They focus on, as you mentioned, there are four sectors: energy, border, land, and waterway infrastructure. And currently the projects in Bhutan are all mapped out, and if you click on each of the projects you can get a timeline of their history, of when they were started, what their current status is. So it's a very very comprehensive database. Thank you, Ria, for enumerating all the challenges that you faced and putting it out there. So I know there is no analysis involved in this, but I want to know what were some of your insights on how the database helped you in understanding Indian foreign policy better, perhaps.
So you know what this database, and first of all, thank you for the shout out for the database. What this database does is it fills a very significant knowledge gap about India's connectivity projects in the region. So, you know, often we hear that, you know, India has this neighborhood first policy, Act East policy, but what is happening
Hmm.
on the ground and what kind of projects is India really doing something with Bhutan?
Hmm.
Many of the projects are not spoken about in the public forums. The power transmission lines, the energy infrastructure
Hmm.
projects, them are not spoken about. So it does fill a significant knowledge gap. And for us also, it was very important that, you know, India has these active projects with the neighboring countries, a large number of them. And it's important to put this out there, you know, in this visual format to show the scale of India's connectivity with the neighboring countries. We hope that this will help policymakers and scholars plan, prioritize, and link projects in the region in terms of the kind of impact that we visualize from this, that we see from this database. As I said before, this is supposed to be an information repository. So, you know, it's supposed to
Hmm.
inform Indian connectivity strategy through new research, knowledge, data which is sometimes missed or overlooked. It will help people develop analytical insights. The filter section of the database really helps map and compare across different projects and decades. So, you know, if you go
Hmm.
to the year filter, you can actually, you know, filter out. You can choose which specific year you want to see or a range of timeline to see, let's say, in which decade India did more projects than the previous decade, or what, you know, last 5 years were there more active projects or suspended projects than the previous 5 years. So it helps you do a longitudinal analysis of India's connectivity project, but also that of stakeholders involved. We also came across, of course, the public entities involved, but there are also a lot of private sector entities involved in the completion of these projects that we don't often talk about.
Hmm.
It also says a lot about how India is conducting projects abroad. It may be government driven, but there is private sector involvement as well. So all of these
Hmm.
insights, they come out through this database.
Right. Now you mentioned the private sector, and so I want to understand, Ria, what are the economic benefits that India hopes to gain through this enhanced cooperation with the neighborhood? So, just a larger question, obviously moving away from the database, on, say, for example, you mentioned, power transmission lines. So, how much, say, power are we getting from those plants, or is it primarily to serve our neighborhood countries? So, what are some of the economic implications of these projects?
I mean, many see the benefits of connectivity are across several areas: economic, political, security, and offer interlinked also. Because, at least in the Indian policy circles, there is a growing realization that India's growth is linked to its neighborhood, and therefore, these connectivity projects are very important. You know, Bangladesh is one of our largest trading partners in the region and fifth largest trading partners overall. But if we don't have proper infrastructure to route that trade through, that's going to be, that's going to be challenging for India in terms of its neighborhood policy, in terms of building economic relations with its neighboring countries. Power transmission lines, India buys and sells power to the neighboring countries. So there is a logic in investing in all of these projects. I'll give you another small example in terms of the integrated check post. I did a paper 2, 3 years ago mapping India's integrated check post, and there was a very clear sign that, you know, when this border infrastructure was built, there was rerouting of trade and there was new trade that was built with the neighboring countries. And this happens because there is a robust infrastructure to support economic relations with the neighboring countries. You know, India aims to become a $7 trillion economy by 2040, and India's growth is linked to its neighborhood country, and therefore it's very important to invest in these infrastructure projects.
Right. Yes, Ria, I think that had to be reiterated because I think a lot of, especially Indian private sector, barring the very large corporations, might be hesitant to invest in our neighborhood because they see political instability, they see civil war. So I think the economic priority there sometimes gets lost. But as you rightly pointed out, there is a logic in making these investments, and India cannot grow without our neighborhood as well growing as well. I think this is a number which a lot of us who work in this area know, that trade across South Asia is very, very low. I think about 5% compared to ASEAN or other regional trading blocs. It's abysmal. We know the SAFTA is almost moribund now. So it is important, as you said, that unless we have physical links, we cannot take that step further and, get greater economic integration. So related to, not directly but sort of indirectly, after economy, another priority that is there for India is strategic priority. So what I want to ask you is, how do these projects also weigh in on that? Because sometimes I feel some projects may not wield very great profits, but maybe India is there just for strategic reasons. Are there any such projects that come to your mind?
I think, see, there is a difference in how India works with connectivity projects today versus what it did, say, 15, 20 years ago. There are some legacy projects in the
Hmm.
neighboring countries that have taken 20 years to complete. And also because sometimes they were not a priority, or perhaps the idea of what the impact of those projects would be was never strategically clear, or how it fit into, as you say, India's strategic priorities was never clear. But how India conducts connectivity today as part of its neighborhood and Act East policies is really focused on delivery. So even if, for example,
Hmm.
the Kaladan multimodal project, right,
Right.
that's been in the works for almost 2 decades now, it's still not
Hmm.
complete. The report said it's 90% complete, but obviously we have to, India also has to balance a lot of the security challenges over there while completing the project. But India did inaugurate the Sitwe terminal, which is a part of the
Hmm.
Kaladan project, right? That's very important for India's access to the northeast region. Goods are moving from India, from Calcutta port to Sitwe, and then onward. So these kind of projects have been strategic, have now, they're not just important for connectivity, but every connectivity project today is strategically important because we also face a different kind of threat in our neighborhood today. Of course, China is one of the drivers of these connectivity projects, but also for India to have better relations with the neighboring countries. It's also a demand from the neighboring countries to have timely delivery on the projects, to have projects that are useful to the neighboring countries. One thing that India does, that India focuses on, at least in the neighboring countries, a lot of focus has been on grant projects, which is slowly shifting to lines of credit mechanism of
Hmm.
how we approach, of how we do connectivity projects abroad, which also then involves a different range of stakeholders and how we look at projects. Because sometimes it's not that India is thinking of a project and taking it to the neighboring countries. It's discussed. The neighboring countries also have a list of national priority projects which countries can then invest in. So these projects are not in particular, let's say, Indian in nature, but it's a result of discussions, of partnerships, of really sitting down for many discussions, and narrowing down that this is the project that both countries will take forward. So I would say, to answer the question, all projects are strategic projects. All projects are a priority for India to complete because it just looks at these, at connectivity differently today.
Right. Yes, you're absolutely correct. I agree with you there. And speaking of, as you said, that countries come together, they have discussions on, projects being beneficial for both. And you said correctly that we extend lines of credit or grants through the MEA to the Ministry of Finance. I was just wondering, Ria, do we have a mechanism where India can do a sort of impact assessment of not just environmental, but a post project completion assessment of how that particular project is helping the local people? Because in my research, at least, I haven't come across any such mechanism where whatever developmental projects we take up, as you said, we're focused on delivery and completion, but after that, how do we know the impact that it's creating?
So we don't, to my knowledge, India doesn't have an impact as a like a structured impact assessment mechanism. But I have come across, for example, one of an important part of India's development cooperation with the neighboring countries is the small development projects or the high impact community development projects. And there is a form that asks the host government, the beneficiary government, about like who this project will impact and how many people, and what's the scope of this project and where it's going
Hmm.
to be, how many people it's going to impact, how it's going to economically change the region. But that's not a very structured way of assessing impact. I think this is something that the Indian system needs to do much better. And they do need to develop a mechanism for it. I am not aware of any existing right now, but there's certainly space for this to develop. I mean, the Indian missions in the neighboring countries, they, at their own level, they do a sort of impact assessment. That's, if you go to any mission website, you will see these documents about India's projects in the neighboring countries, like how many schools were built and how many people it has affected. But again, there's no structured way of doing that. That information is available. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, depending on when it was collected. So, this would be a great service to Indian foreign policy and its projects abroad, to its development cooperation, to do impact assessment.
Right. Yes, this is something that I've also been thinking about for a while. And yes, so we did recognize another gap in data and knowledge that's available on our neighborhood, because it's important to understand, right? We can talk about a big list of projects, we can, fund it and, hope that, oh, yes, it's improving lives. But ultimately, it has to be backed by data, which is, again, verifiable and provided by, all the parties involved. So coming to, you mentioned China, so we cannot talk about India's neighborhood without addressing that elephant in the room. So, Ria, how do you think the interests and actions of not only China, of both China and the US, how do these countries influence India's neighborhood strategy?
So let's start with China first. I mean, no, actually, let's start with the broad picture first. See, there are both
Okay.
internal and external factors that influence India's approach abroad. Of course, China or any other country, including the like minded partners, they do impact how India does projects abroad in terms of partnerships, in terms of how to deliver certain projects. But that said, there are also many internal drivers. Internal drivers being, India looks at becoming a regional leader. India has its own ambition of becoming a $7 trillion economy. All of these factor in when India is looking at projects abroad. When India is designing, for example, in the infrastructure and logistics space, if it's designing the Sagar Mala plan, the Bharat Mala plan, it also has a component where it can be extended to the neighboring countries. India, the Prime Minister's Gati Shakti initiative is also, the government of India is also trying to extend it to the neighboring countries as an extension of what it can do. So, internal, I mean, domestic
Hmm.
drivers, India's own ambitions are also a very strong part of what drives India's approach abroad. But that said, one cannot deny that China is a factor. The Belt and Road Initiative projects in the neighborhood is something that India is closely looking at. Almost all of India's neighboring countries are part of BRI, except Bhutan, and countries are also signing on to the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative. So, this is a development that is alarming India. If you look at India's projects in different sectors in the neighborhood, for example, in seaport project, something I recently worked on, if India has a project in a neighboring country, so does China. China also has a port project in the neighboring country. So there is a competitive and security element to that as well. That said, in terms of the other like-minded partners like US and others, see, they also want, as part of their Indo-Pacific policy, Indo-Pacific Outlook initiative, they also see India playing a much larger role in the Indian Ocean region. And a lot of that starts with India's immediate neighborhood, whether it's land neighborhood, whether it's maritime neighborhood. So US, for example, last year offering 500 million, almost $500 million for the Colombo Port project, which of course is at a very different stage now. Which has followed through right now. But the fact that US offered it was to support India's projects in the neighboring countries, and a very important project at the Colombo port. So how India engages with these different actors has also changed over the years. If you thought about 15 years ago for a US India partnership in a port project, that perhaps would not have been possible. But India also realizes that it cannot match China dollar for dollar. India needs to engage with
Mm.
partner countries, needs to engage with like minded countries to deliver on the projects in the region. Our financial resources are also limited. We do see the need for working collectively, collaboratively to deliver on these projects.
Right. Yes, you're correct. And mentioning, like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, I just wanted to refer to something that you mentioned in your last podcast, was that you saw Japan emerging as a partner for India in the neighborhood, and you also mentioned that Australia is very interested in BeamStack. So just sort of touching upon the role of Quad, do you see how do you envision sort of Japan and Australia playing a role in this? What motivates them, and how can they expand their role in this process?
So, for both Japan and Australia, see, this region is important as part of their Indo Pacific policy. For Japan, it's the free and open Indo Pacific policy that they have, where they see connectivity with this region as very important. They see their engagement in this region, both on the economic and defense and development side, very important. Similarly, for Australia, what it calls the Northeast Indian Ocean region, which is the Bay of Bengal, Andaman Sea, Australia triangle. This is a neighborhood
Mm.
for Australia, and that drives a lot of its engagements that are taking place and also like different initiatives. For example, Australia has a $32 million SARIC initiative, the South Asia Regional
Mm.
Infrastructure Connectivity Initiative, which is really in partnership with World Bank and IFC, to deliver on some of the connectivity projects in India's neighborhood. And it is consulting with India on that as well. So, in terms of their Indo Pacific outlook, in terms of being part of the neighborhood, they do see themselves as playing a larger role in the region. But in terms of the Quad approach, I think for both Australia and Japan, the idea is again, as with the US, that India should be a leading actor in the Indian Ocean region, and rest of the partner countries will support India's ambitions in that region, because the overarching goal is the same: to ensure a free and open Indo Pacific, to counter China's growing influence in the region, and to deliver public goods to the region. That's what the Quad is focused on.
Mm.
So this is broadly what drives all of them to come together. The combination of strategic, economic,
Mm.
diplomatic development goals, by investing in infrastructure, promoting trade, fostering regional cooperation. They aim to shape the region's future, India's place in it, and also secure their own interest by doing so. And all of these countries, they bring different strengths to the region. Australia
Mm.
has a fantastic capacity, for example, in logistics automation, in capacity building and training. Japan is very good at building infrastructure. It's involved in the Matarbari port in Bangladesh. It's building infrastructure in India's northeast region, many roads and highways as well. So really contributing to India's regional connectivity plan.
Mm.
And these actors are very important because for India, being a neighbor, being the large country that is, it has a different perception in the neighborhood, sometimes good, sometimes
Mm.
bad, often bad. So, having these other partner countries come in and support these initiatives, which really don't have much of a historical baggage in the region, is is good for facilitating India's own initiatives as well. And India is, as I said before, India today is very comfortable with working with partners.
Right. Yes, you made some very important points there, Ria. That these partners, especially Japan, Australia, our neighbors, would also be more willing and open to work with them. They come with a certain level of expertise, which complements our sort of all the initiatives that we have in the region. So, just to sort of come to an end of this conversation, I just want to ask you one last question since you mentioned perception. So I want to know what India's perception is, of our neighborhood. As you mentioned initially, we have a neighborhood first policy, we have Act East policy, we have our Prime Minister, saying things that we must not only build infrastructure, but we must also build bridges of trust. So, beyond all of those railways and roads and bridges, very physical assets, there is this very important underlying foundation of trust, which I think is, everything else is built on that. So how have you seen, since you've been working on this for so long, how has this trust building process been expedited by India?
That's a really good question. So different levels and in different spaces it comes out differently. Like you mentioned, like you rightly said, that India has delivered on these physical infrastructure connectivity projects, whether you
Mm.
talk about 6 out of 7 historical railway lines with Bangladesh being operationalized, almost 12 ICPs operated in the last decade, petroleum pipelines in the region, the kind of infrastructure we had not thought about before. But how do you really operationalize this infrastructure? Building infrastructure itself takes trust, and operationalizing the infrastructure requires a different level of trust. And I think what India's approach is today is, I mean, you really need businessmen to come together who, to shift their historical supply chains to go through the neighboring countries. It does require a lot of trust building across different sectors. G2G level doesn't happen, that's great. But at the private sector, at the operational level, with the freight forwarders, the trading community, how do you make sure that the trust happens? One is, of course, to have transparency in the interactions and the negotiations that are taking place for these different processes, and what the benefits, and really consulting on what the benefits of this infrastructure would be. We did an exercise at Indian Ports few years ago, when I was in a different job, and we really focused on going to the ground level and bridging that information gap between what was announced in New Delhi and what was going to be implemented at the ground level. And that really changed the scenario of trading across borders from the seaports in the region. And this is something that also has to be replicated when it comes to engaging with our neighboring countries in terms of these different infrastructure projects. Trust building is an essential part, and it also comes through delivery, right? You promise a
Mhm.
project that doesn't get delivered for 15 years. The carrot and stick policy is perhaps good sometimes, but it doesn't always work. And this is your neighborhood. It's been there forever. You've been engaging with them for many decades. So they're also smart countries. They also want benefit. They also want development. So they're going to use it however possible. What India is doing well is expanding its engagements. So without really a lot of conditions. So whether it is a friendly or an adversarial government in the neighborhood, or not adversarial but not so friendly government in the neighborhood, India does choose to
Mm.
engage, and that engagement is very important for trust building. So I think these new mechanisms that India is adopting, we will see their results in some time, but certainly a lot of progress has been made in the last decade, and I'm just seeing how this would improve further.
Right. Thank you so much, Ria. I'm glad that we're ending on a note of optimism, especially on a topic that I think, the overall outlook is very pessimistic. But I'm glad that you shed light on everything that we're doing and all the progress that we're making. Because, yeah, being positive is, I think, the first step. So, thank you so much, Ria, for joining us today in this episode. And I hope this was valuable for all our listeners. And tune into the next episode of All Things Policy. Thank you, Ria, once again.
Thank you, Vanshika. Thank you very much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.